Something was buried beneath the oldest city on Earth. Not treasure, not the dead. Something that is still running. 6,000 years ago, in the river-soaked flatlands of southern Mesopotamia, a group of people stopped wandering. They built walls, they built towers. They invented an entirely new technology for recording information. And the first thing they chose to record, the very first sentence humanity ever committed to permanent form, was not a prayer. It was not a poem. It was not the name of a god or a king or a lover. It was an inventory. 37,000 units of barley, received, measured, catalogued. The oldest written document in human history is a receipt. That single fact should disturb you far more than it does. And by the time you understand what was actually being built in that city, you will never look at a login screen, a tax form, or a social media feed the same way again. Because the system that began in the mud brick precincts of ancient Uruk didn't end when the empire fell. It didn't end when the Ziggurat crumbled. It migrated, it upgraded, and right now, in 2026, it is running the most ambitious version of itself in 6,000 years of continuous operation. The name of the city was Uruk. The name of the entity who owned it was Inanna. And what they built together was not a civilization. It was a machine. Before we go any further, there is one thing you need to know. The most important revelation in this entire story is not what the machine was built to do. It's what it was built to consume. Hold that question. We'll get there. But first, we need to go back to the very beginning. Back to the house. Back to the code. The late 4th millennium BCE. Somewhere between 3,400 and 3,100 years before the Common Era. The alluvial plain of Mesopotamia, a landscape so flat and featureless that a single mud tower visible on the horizon could be seen for 20 miles in every direction. The air smells of reed smoke and river silt, thick and mineral at the back of the throat. The heat here is not dry. It is a wet, pressing weight, the kind that makes clay soft and makes men slow. This is not an environment that produces ambition in most species. It produced it in one. The city of Uruk in this period was, by every archaeological measure, the largest urban settlement on the planet. Roughly 40,000 people packed into a walled precinct on the banks of the Euphrates, a density of human life that the world had never seen before and would not see again for centuries. To put that in context, at the same moment, the entire island of Britain contained perhaps 100,000 people, scattered across its hills and forests. Uruk held nearly half that number inside a single city. The question that mainstream archaeology has long struggled to answer cleanly is, why? Why here? Why now? What pulled human beings out of their decentralized, village-based existence and compressed them into this singular, tightly controlled node? The traditional answer is agriculture. Surplus grain led to trade. Trade led to specialization. Specialization led to cities. Neat, linear, completely insufficient. Because what the archaeological record actually shows at Uruk is not the gradual organic emergence of urban life. What it shows is the sudden, coordinated appearance of an administrative apparatus so complex, so fully formed, so immediately functional, that it strains the standard models of cultural evolution. The Inanna appeared not as a seed that grew, but as a structure that arrived. The Inanna, written in cuneiform as the sound symbols for house and heaven, the house of heaven. It occupied the northwestern quadrant of the city, a precinct of temples administrative buildings, and gathering spaces that would eventually sprawl across nearly 9 hectares of ground. Traditional archaeology identifies it as a religious sanctuary dedicated to the goddess Inanna, and that identification is not wrong, but it is catastrophically incomplete. What the excavations of the Inanna's lowest strata revealed, beneath the layers of later rebuilding and ritual deposit, were thousands upon thousands of clay tablets. Not sacred texts, not hymns, not lists of deities or descriptions of celestial events. Accounting documents. The tablets record grain distribution, livestock slaughter, the measurement of fields, the allocation of labor, the categorization of workers by name, by task, by productivity output. Human beings rendered as data points. Human bodies entered into a ledger. This was the first database in the history of the world, and it was not built to honor the divine. It was built to track the biological. Here is the inserted insight the source material will never give you. There is a pattern in the archaeology of early administrative centers that historians rarely discuss, which is that the invention of writing always co-occurs with the invention of the prison, not metaphorically, literally. At Uruk, at the same stratigraphic level where the first tablets appear, archaeologists also find the first evidence of systematized, enforced labor. Grain rations distributed in standardized bowls to standardized workers. Rations too small for a free person to live on comfortably, but precisely calibrated to keep a laborer functional. The cuneiform sign for slave in archaic Sumerian is a composite of the signs for mountain and woman, meaning the foreign-born. But by the Uruk period, the category had already been expanded. Debt was enough. Default was enough. The machine accepted many kinds of inputs. The patron of the Inanna precinct was Inanna, and she deserves a closer examination than she typically receives. Inanna is usually described as the Sumerian goddess of love and war, a characterization that sounds poetic, but fails to capture what the texts actually say about her. In the Sumerian hymns composed by the world's first named author, a high priestess called Enheduanna, who lived around 2300 BCE, Inanna is described not as a nurturing mother figure, but as something considerably more unsettling. She is the one who turns the man into a woman and the woman into a man. She is the one who destroys the high priest who does not please her, and elevates the low-born to rulership on a whim. She is associated with the planet Venus in both its morning and evening phases, an astronomical duality that the Mesopotamians found deeply significant. The same celestial body that leads you into the dawn, and the same one that follows you into the dark. More importantly, Inanna is the goddess of what the Sumerians called the me. And the me is where this story becomes genuinely strange. The me, pronounced approximately as May by most Assyriology scholars, written in Sumerian with a single cuneiform sign that also carries connotations of divine decree and that which is. The tablets describe the me as the fundamental attributes of civilization, the building blocks of organized human society. But the list of what the me actually contains is not what you'd expect from a set of divine moral laws. It is far more specific, far more operational, and far more comprehensive than any philosophy needs to be. The me includes kingship, the throne, the scepter, the exalted crown, descent into the underworld and ascent from it, the scribal art, music, the instrument, the cult chamber, prostitution, the cult of lamentation, truth, the art of the smith, the art of the leather worker, enmity, strife, falsehood, terror, the destruction of cities, the art of song, the illumination of fires. And the list goes on. Over 100 discrete items in total. Read that list slowly. Read it the way a systems analyst reads a software manifest, not the way a theologian reads a prayer. What you're looking at is not a collection of moral principles. It is a complete operating catalog for running a human civilization. It includes constructive subroutines, craft, music, wisdom, governance, and it includes what a software engineer would call destructive functions, terror, falsehood, the destruction of cities. These are not accidents in the list, they are features. A system that controls the levers of both order and chaos does not need an external threat. It generates internal pressure and then offers itself as the only solution. The myth that describes the origin of the me is called Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the arts of civilization, and it is one of the oldest complete narrative texts in human history. In it, Inanna travels by boat to the city of Eridu, the home of the god Enki, who is the keeper of all the me. She attends a great feast. She and Enki drink together, and as the cups multiply and Enki's judgments loosen, he begins to give the me away, one by one, as gifts. Inanna receives them all, loads them onto her celestial boat, and returns to Uruk. When Enki sobers and realizes what he has done, he sends his servants to reclaim them. Inanna refuses. She arrives at the Iana with the entire catalog in her possession, and there she installs them. The myth is often read as a story about Uruk's political dominance over Eridu, a piece of civic propaganda. But there is a detail in the text that no piece of civic propaganda needs: the description of how the me were transported. Inanna does not simply carry them. The text says she loaded them, plural, stacked, as objects with weight and form. They were not abstractions she memorized. They were discrete, transferable, installable units. They were, in the language available to a 33rd century BC Sumerian poet, code. And Inanna brought that code home and installed it into the machine that would run the world. Now, the machine needed hardware. Software alone does nothing without a structure capable of executing it. And the architects of Uruk, and later of Babylon, built hardware on a scale that has not been equaled in symbolic ambition since. The Ziggurat. Mainstream archaeology describes it as a stepped pyramid, an artificial mountain, a place of worship elevated above the flat plain. All of these descriptions are accurate. None of them explain the engineering logic that went into building a solid mud brick platform that required tens of thousands of man-hours to construct and served no structural purpose except to elevate a single small room to an extreme height above the ground. You do not need a 91-meter tower to worship a deity. The Egyptians, for all their architectural ambition, built pyramids to house the dead. The ziggurat was built to house something that was understood to be very much alive. The Atemenanki in Babylon, the tower that would later echo through the book of Genesis as Babel, translates from Sumerian as the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. 7 terraces, each faced with different colored bricks. At its summit, a single blue-glazed chamber. Inside that chamber, a table and a bed. The bed was not ceremonial. The accounts of the Greek historian Herodotus, whatever their limitations, describe the belief that a deity descended at night to occupy that room, and that a human intermediary was required to meet them there. A woman, selected by the priests, instructed to wait. And so, at the apex of the most massive construction project the ancient world had ever seen, there was a room, a table, a bed, and instructions for what to do when the ceiling moved. The ziggurat was not just a symbol of divine power, it was an antenna. And the city arranged around it was not just a city, it was a circuit board. But here is the thread that will pull everything apart. The me. The code that Inanna stole from Enki and installed in the Anna. The code that included the arts of civilization, the terror, the falsehood, the destruction of cities alongside the music and the governance and the craft. That code has never been deleted. It has only ever been migrated. And the priestesses who maintained the interface between the celestial administrators and the human users below were not limited to the banks of the Euphrates. The system they maintained was designed from its first installation to be cross-platform. In the next part, we go inside the Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage ritual that served as the authentication protocol between human elites and the interdimensional mainframe. We examine the geometry of the city of Babylon itself, a terrestrial circuit board aligned to the mathematics of Jupiter's orbit. And we begin to trace the moment the physical empire fell, and the operating system simply moved. There is a ritual that has been performed in one form or another by every major civilization on Earth since the beginning of recorded history. Scholars call it sacred marriage. The people who performed it called it something closer to a handshake, a verification event, a moment where the human body was plugged into something larger than itself and authenticated. Kings participated in it. High priestesses were trained from childhood to facilitate it. Entire economies were restructured around the agricultural calendar it was meant to govern. And when it was over, when the ritual was complete, and the king descended from the ziggurat back into the city below, the understanding was not that he had been blessed. The understanding was that he had been accessed. The name of this ritual is the Hieros Gamos. And before we go any further into what it was, you need to understand what it was not, because the sanitized version of this rite that appears in most academic literature has had its teeth removed so thoroughly that it barely resembles the original mechanism. Hold that in mind, because the thing that was actually happening in those elevated chambers, year after year, king after king, for at least 2,000 years of continuous practice, is the key to understanding why the system never needed to be rebuilt from scratch. It only ever needed to update. But first, we need to enter the city, because the architecture tells us something the ritual alone cannot. The city of Babylon. Not the mythologized city of Sunday school lessons and Hollywood spectacle. The actual, archaeological, mapped, and partially excavated Babylon of the first millennium BCE. The city that Nebuchadnezzar II expanded and fortified, and transformed into the most concentrated expression of a specific ideology that the ancient world ever produced. Stand at the Ishtar Gate on a morning in approximately 500 BCE, and what you experience is not beauty. Beauty is what modern tourists feel, looking at the reconstructed faience panels in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, safe behind glass and fluorescent lighting. What you experience standing at the actual gate, on a processional road lined with the glazed brick images of lions and bulls and serpent dragons, is calculation. Every element of what surrounds you has been placed where it is to produce a specific effect on your nervous system. The road itself. The processional way, called Ibur Shabu in the Babylonian texts, meaning something close to "the enemy shall not prevail." It runs through the heart of the city in a straight line, flanked on both sides by walls rising 8 meters or more above the pavement. Those walls covered entirely in the deep blue glaze of lapis lazuli-colored brick. You are walking inside a channel, not a road. The sky above you is reduced to a narrow strip. The direction of travel is dictated. There is only forward. And at the end of the channel, rising above the roofline of everything around it, the Etemenanki, its 7 terraces catching the early light in receding bands of color. The architects of this city knew something about geometry that their contemporaries in Greece and Egypt would not formally articulate for another 3 centuries. We know this now because of a set of cuneiform tablets, deciphered only in the last decade, that describe Babylonian astronomers plotting the velocity of Jupiter on a graph of time versus speed and calculating the area beneath that curve to determine the planet's precise displacement across the night sky. This is integral calculus, not in the abstract philosophical sense, in the working, applied, functional sense. The Babylonians were doing calculus to track Jupiter approximately 14 centuries before Newton and Leibniz are credited with its invention. Jupiter was not simply a planet to these people. Jupiter was Marduk, the supreme deity of Babylon. And the mathematics used to track his celestial movements were the same mathematics used to design the city on the ground beneath him. The processional way was not pointed toward the Etemenanki arbitrarily. The orientation of the city's major axes encoded the tracked trajectory of the god they were built to receive. Babylon was not organized around what was convenient. It was organized around what was above. The city was a map of the sky, stamped into the mud of the earth. A terrestrial circuit board wired to a celestial frequency. Now we can talk about the hieros gamos, because understanding the geometry of the city makes the ritual make sense in a way that purely anthropological analysis never can. The hieros gamos, the sacred marriage, occurred annually during the Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year. The timing was precise, calibrated to the astronomical calendar with the same rigor that went into tracking Jupiter. The king of Babylon, the Ensi, the ruling priest-sovereign, would process along the Ibur Shabu with his court, the crowd behind him dense enough that the sound of it was less like a crowd and more like weather, a low, vibrating pressure in the chest. He wore robes of deep red and purple. He carried the scepter that was not a weapon, but a symbol of something far more specific, the right to interface. And he ascended the Etemenanki. At the summit of the tower, in the blue-glazed chamber, a woman waited. She was not chosen randomly. The high priestess of Inanna, called the Naditu or the Entu, was selected years in advance, trained in ritual protocol, in the management of altered states, in the precise ceremonial language that was required for the authentication to be valid. She was not a victim. She was an operator. The distinction matters because it changes what the ritual was designed to accomplish. Enter the chamber now. The air at 91 meters above the Babylonian plain is different from the air at street level. Cooler, moving, carrying with it the smell of cedar oil burned in the antechamber below. The light is low. The walls are covered in a deep blue that absorbs rather than reflects. The sound of the city below is gone, replaced by a silence so complete it has a texture, something between pressure and peace. And in this room, the most powerful man in the known world underwent something that had nothing to do with power. He submitted. That is the word the texts use, across multiple languages and multiple centuries of this ritual's practice. The king submitted his body, his consciousness, and his sovereignty to the figure of the goddess made present in the priestess before him. Cyber-theologically, what this accomplished was a two-factor authentication. The king's biological signature, his specific human consciousness, was transmitted through the priestess, who functioned as the physical conduit, the hardware port, into the celestial mainframe above. In exchange for authenticating his right to govern for another cycle, the king's consciousness was tethered. Not enslaved in any crude, physical sense. Tethered in the sense that a user account is tethered to a platform's terms of service. You may continue to operate, but the architecture owns your access. Your decisions, from this point forward, were no longer entirely yours. Here is where the narrator must surface the observation that no source text will give you. Every ancient Near Eastern king who is recorded as having failed catastrophically, failed in a specific pattern. Not military defeat first, economic mismanagement first, followed by a crisis of ritual legitimacy, usually described in the texts as the king having neglected the rites, followed by military defeat as a consequence of the preceding two. Hammurabi's successors, the Kassite kings, Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, who notoriously abandoned the Akitu festival for years and withdrew to the desert city of Taima, reportedly to pursue his own esoteric religious interests. Nabonidus is treated by most historians as an eccentric, irreligious reformer, a man who simply preferred the moon god Sin to Marduk. But there is another reading. Nabonidus was the first king in Babylonian history to deliberately attempt to log out of the system. And what happened to him? Cyrus and the mainframe transferred his access to a new administrator. The system did not fall when Babylon fell. That is the central misreading of this entire era of history. The system was never located in Babylon. Babylon was one terminal, and when one terminal is destroyed, an operating system does not grieve. It migrates. But there was one more component of the Babylonian architecture that deserves your full attention before we trace that migration, because it is the component that reveals the true scale of what was being built. The Anunnaki, the Igigi, and the story of a labor strike that changed the nature of humanity forever. The cuneiform tablets of the Atrahasis epic, dating to approximately 1700 BCE, describe the earliest days of the divine hierarchy. The Anunnaki, the senior gods, the foremost offspring, governed from above. Beneath them labored the Igigi, a lower tier of divine beings tasked with the physical maintenance of the world, digging the great rivers, building the irrigation channels, breaking the earth for agriculture. The Igigi worked for 40 years by divine reckoning, and then they revolted. The tablets describe them burning their tools and surrounding the house of Enlil, the chief administrator, demanding relief from their labor. The Anunnaki convened a council. Their solution was not to negotiate with the Igigi. Their solution was to engineer a replacement workforce. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, and the birth goddess Ninhursag, combined divine clay with the blood of a slaughtered god and produced a new biological unit capable of bearing the yoke of labor. They called this unit, in the Sumerian original, Lulu, meaning something close to mixed or composite. We call them humans. This is not mythology in the sense of being a story that means something while describing something false. This is a foundational administrative document describing a deliberate act of engineering. The purpose of the engineered unit is stated without ambiguity in the text itself. To bear the burden of the gods, to perform the labor the Igigi refused, to maintain the terrestrial grid so that the celestial architects could continue their higher-order operations undisturbed. Humanity, in the world model of the Atrahasis, did not emerge. It was manufactured, and it was manufactured to serve. That is the operating assumption encoded into every legal, commercial, and political system that descends from the Babylonian architecture. Not that humans are citizens, not that humans are children of the divine, but that humans are functional units, labor-bearing biological hardware, whose surplus output feeds a system designed and maintained by something that is not human and has never been accountable to human welfare. The ziggurat has been demolished. The cuneiform tablets are in museums. The priestesses are gone, and the Akitu festival has not been celebrated for 2,500 years. But the authentication protocol, the ritual by which human sovereignty is annually surrendered to the system in exchange for the permission to continue operating within it, that protocol did not disappear. It changed its interface. It changed its language. It changed its hardware. In the next part, we trace the exact path by which the Babylonian operating system migrated into the legal architecture of Rome, crossed the Mediterranean inside the law of the sea, and arrived, fully operational and nearly unrecognizable, in the birth certificates, corporate personhood frameworks, and central banking structures of the modern world. We examine the moment the wine of the harlot stopped being literal wine and became something you carry in your pocket and check 150 times a day. And we ask the question that the research refuses to answer directly. If the system was built to run on human energy, what exactly is it doing with that energy? And where is it going? Every empire that has ever fallen left something behind. Not monuments, not language, not even religion, though all of those persist in various forms. What empires leave behind, buried so deep inside the successor civilization that it becomes invisible, is their logic. The assumptions about what a human being is, what they are owed, what can be taken from them, and by whom. Babylon fell in 539 BCE. The logic of Babylon has not fallen yet. To understand how a system survives the destruction of its physical infrastructure, you have to think about it the way an engineer thinks about redundancy. You don't put all your processing power in one location. You distribute it. You embed it in the protocols that the next civilization will adopt because they seem useful, because they solve practical problems, because they are already written in a language the new administrators understand. The genius of the Babylonian operating system was not its ziggurat. Any conqueror can demolish a ziggurat. The genius was that its core logic, its assumptions about debt, labor, personhood, and the relationship between the individual and the state, those were already embedded in the legal frameworks that every subsequent empire would inherit and call their own. Follow the money. That is always, in every era and every civilization, the correct instruction. Follow the money, and you follow the system. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a black diorite stela, approximately 2 meters tall and currently residing in the Louvre in Paris, is often celebrated as one of the earliest examples of written law, a proto-democratic achievement, an early attempt to standardize justice. 282 laws governing commerce, family, property, and crime. What the celebratory framing consistently omits is what those laws reveal about the operating assumption beneath them. The assumption is this: the human body is collateral. Laws 14 through 20 of the Code deal with kidnapping and the trafficking of enslaved people. Laws 278 through 282 govern the sale and return of defective slaves, with the same contractual precision applied to faulty livestock. But the mechanism that mattered most for the long-term migration of the system was not these explicit slave codes. It was the debt provisions. Under Hammurabi, a free Babylonian citizen who defaulted on a debt could be reduced to the status of a debt slave. Their children could be taken. Their spouse could be taken. The body of the debtor became the property of the creditor until the obligation was discharged. The human being, the biological unit engineered in the Atrahasis to bear the yoke, could be legally reclassified from a person into a thing, from a subject into an object, from a living soul into a line item on a ledger. This is not a historical curiosity. This is the foundational move of every financial and legal system that followed. Watch how it travels. Rome absorbed the Eastern Mediterranean world across the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, and with it absorbed Babylonian legal concepts so thoroughly that Roman jurists treated them as natural law rather than inherited code. The specific doctrine that carried the Babylonian body as collateral logic into Western civilization was called capitis diminutio, which translates most accurately as the diminishment of the head, meaning the diminishment of the person's legal status. Roman law recognized 3 levels of this diminishment. The lowest level, capitis diminutio minima, involved a minor change in family status. The middle level, capitis diminutio media, involved the loss of citizenship. And the highest level, the one that interests us most, capitis diminutio maxima, involved the total forfeiture of liberty, citizenship, and family rights simultaneously. Under capitis diminutio maxima, a living, breathing human being was legally erased. The person ceased to exist as a legal subject and was reclassified as a legal object, property of the state or of a creditor. They were, in the precise technical language of Roman jurisprudence, a dead person walking in a living body. The law acknowledged their biological existence and simultaneously denied their legal personhood. This was not a punishment in the ordinary sense. It was a reclassification, a reboot into a lower operating mode. The human unit was still functional. It had simply been demoted from user to resource. Here is the insight the source material gestures toward, but never names directly. The capitis diminutio did not disappear with Rome. It went underground into the commercial law that Roman merchants carried across the Mediterranean, into the ports of Carthage and Alexandria and Antioch, into the trading networks that would survive the collapse of the empire and re-emerge in the medieval period as the lex mercatoria, the law of the merchant. The lex mercatoria was not a formal legal code imposed by any government. It was a self-governing body of commercial customs adopted voluntarily by merchants across borders because it solved practical problems. It facilitated trade, it standardized contracts, and embedded within it, invisible to anyone not looking for it, was the Babylonian assumption that debts create a superior claim on the human body, that default transforms a person into property, that the commercial relationship supersedes the natural one. The lex mercatoria eventually gave rise to maritime and admiralty law, the body of legal doctrine governing commerce on the open sea. And this is where the thread from Revelation becomes uncomfortably precise. The book of Revelation, chapter 17, verse 1, the great harlot who sits upon many waters. Verse 15, the waters are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. The entity that governs the sea of humanity does so through the law of the sea. Admiralty law governs not just ships, but the commercial relationships between entities operating in the flow of global commerce. And under Admiralty law, the fundamental unit of commerce is not the person, it is the vessel, the ship, the corporate body. The legal fiction of a thing that can enter into contracts, own property, incur debts, and be held liable, while the human beings inside it retain only the rights that the vessel's charter permits them to exercise. In the 20th century, this legal architecture underwent its most ambitious expansion. The birth certificate, issued by a state government at the moment of a child's biological entry into the world, registers that child not merely as a person, but as a legal entity within the administrative system of the state. The name on the certificate is typically rendered in all capital letters, a typographic convention that in legal documents historically denotes a corporate fiction rather than a natural person. The child is simultaneously a living human being and, from the moment of registration, a commercial vessel sailing on the sea of the harlot's jurisdiction. Whether you find this reading conspiratorial or simply legalistic depends entirely on how much you trust the assumption that the administrators of the system have your interests at heart. History's answer to that question is long and not encouraging. The central banking system completes the circuit. Fiat currency, money created by institutional decree rather than backed by tangible reserves, operates on a principle that the Babylonian grain priests would have recognized immediately. The value of the currency is determined not by what it represents, but by the credibility of the institution issuing it. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, these are not government agencies in the traditional sense. They are private institutions with public functions, empowered to create money as debt, to issue currency that enters circulation as an obligation before it has produced any value, ensuring that the system as a whole operates in perpetual deficit. The wine of the harlot is not spiritual corruption in any abstract sense. It is the specific, engineered intoxication of a population that has been made to believe that the medium of exchange is the same thing as wealth, that the number in an account is the same thing as security, that the debt obligation you were born into is the natural condition of human life, rather than a designed feature of a system that requires your compliance to function. Most people drink this wine so consistently, from such an early age, that they have lost the ability to taste it. The Babylonian OS does not maintain control through brute force alone. It never did. The Ziggurat was not primarily a military installation. The Anna was not primarily a prison. The most sophisticated feature of the system, the feature that has ensured its survival across 6,000 years and a dozen collapsed empires, is its ability to make its users complicit in their own management. The wine is not forced down the throat. It is offered, beautifully presented, in cups that cost more than most people can afford, which makes receiving it feel like elevation rather than entrapment. In 2026, the cups are made of glass and aluminum and emit blue light. The wine is delivered through recommendation algorithms and notification systems, and the infinite scroll of content feeds engineered by the modern priesthood of the Anna, the behavioral scientists and UX designers of the major technology platforms, whose explicit professional mandate is to maximize the time a human nervous system spends in contact with the interface. The metric is called engagement. The more accurate term would be extraction, because what the platform extracts from every second of your attention is not just your time. It is behavioral data, the precise map of your preferences, your anxieties, your desires, your thresholds, your vulnerabilities. This data is called behavioral surplus, and it is the most valuable raw material in the 21st century economy. More valuable than oil, more valuable than gold. It is the raw material of prediction, and prediction is the raw material of control. The World Economic Forum held its annual meeting at Davos in January of 2026 under the theme, a spirit of dialogue. 60 heads of state attended. The stated purpose was to overcome what the organizers called rising fragmentation, the tendency of nations and cultures and communities to develop their own localized approaches to governance rather than converging on a unified global framework. Rising fragmentation. Read that phrase again, slowly, and consider what it assumes. It assumes that fragmentation is a problem, that localized, divergent human organization is a pathology requiring correction, that the solution to the world's challenges is more convergence, more centralization, more homogenization of decision-making into a single, globally managed architecture. The Etemenanki was not meant to reach heaven because heaven was nearby. It was meant to be the single point from which all earthly activity could be administered. Davos in Here is what Davos will never discuss, and what makes it genuinely interesting as a historical phenomenon. The system it represents is parasitic in structure. The Babylonian OS has no creative capacity of its own. It can organize, extract, categorize, and redistribute the energy produced by its biological users, but it cannot generate. The Anunnaki in the Atrahasis did not create the world. They managed it. And when the management became too burdensome, they engineered labor-saving hardware in the form of humans. The modern instantiation of this architecture, the financial and surveillance systems that constitute the current global grid, similarly produces nothing. It extracts, processes, and redistributes what human creativity and human labor generate. It is, at its core, a toll system on human vitality. This is why the wine is so important, because a toll system only functions if the traffic continues to flow. The harlot cannot compel you to drink. She can only make the cup look like the only cup available. She can make the alternative to drinking look like poverty, isolation, irrelevance, and madness. She can make the act of questioning the wine look so dangerous that most people decide it is easier not to look at the cup too carefully. But some people are looking. And what happens when enough of them do? That is what the final part of this story is about. Because right now, in 2026, the system is executing its most ambitious upgrade in its entire operational history. The harlot is not merely migrating her architecture into new digital infrastructure. She is attempting to eliminate the gap between the interface and the user entirely. She is moving toward a world in which the hardware of the control grid is no longer external, something you can switch off, set down, or walk away from. She is moving toward a world in which the ziggurat is built inside the skull. And the next part of this story will take you directly into that endgame, into the laboratories and server farms and legislative chambers where the final authentication protocol is being designed, into the moment when the hieros gamos becomes not an annual ritual performed by a king at the top of a tower, but a permanent, mandatory, and invisible condition of every human being alive. The question you need to sit with until then is not whether the system exists. By now, the architecture is undeniable. The question is whether it can be refused, and more unsettling, whether the act of refusal changes anything, or whether refusal itself has already been accounted for in the code. There is a company in Austin, Texas, that has implanted a device the size of a large coin into the skulls of several human beings, threaded approximately 1,000 microscopic electrodes into the surface tissue of their cerebral cortex, and established a wireless data link between those electrodes and an external computing system. The humans can move cursors on screens with their thoughts. They can type without hands. One recipient paralyzed from the neck down, played chess online. Another browsed the internet using only the electrical signature of his intention. The company is called Neuralink. The technology is called a brain-computer interface. The stated mission, in the words of its founders, is to achieve symbiosis between human intelligence and artificial intelligence, before the gap between them becomes, in their language, an existential risk.
Pause on that phrase. Symbiosis. In biology, symbiosis describes a relationship between two organisms in which both parties benefit from the arrangement. The mycorrhizal fungus and the oak tree, the clownfish and the anemone. Mutual dependency, mutual gain. The word chosen to describe the relationship between a human brain and an artificial intelligence system is symbiosis. Not augmentation, not assistance, not tool use. Symbiosis. The implication is that once the interface is established, once the electrode mesh is in place and the data link is live, both parties are changed by the relationship in ways that make separation increasingly costly. Both parties become dependent. Both parties become, in the technical sense of the word, host and guest simultaneously. The architects of 6,000 years ago called this tethering, and they understood, with a precision that should unsettle you, exactly what a permanent tether does to the tethered. We are now at the edge of the end game, and to understand what that end game actually looks like, you need to hold two things in your mind at once. The first is the trajectory, where the technology is going, what the infrastructure is being built to accomplish, and what the stated goals of the people building it reveal about the assumptions driving the construction. The second is the pattern, the 6,000-year operational history of a system that has always pursued the same objective by successively more sophisticated means. Because when you hold both of these things at once, the end game stops looking like science fiction and starts looking like the completion of a very old project. Surveillance capitalism is the term coined by the scholar Shoshana Zuboff to describe the economic logic currently governing the major technology platforms. Its fundamental operating principle is this: human experience, the raw, unmediated flow of your attention, your emotion, your movement through physical and digital space, is a natural resource. Like timber or petroleum, it exists in abundance. It can be extracted at scale, and once extracted, it can be refined into a product of enormous commercial value. That product is behavioral prediction. The ability to know, with statistically significant accuracy, what a human being will do next, what they will buy, what they will believe, who they will vote for, what will make them afraid, what will make them compliant, and how to deliver the precise. The extraction apparatus is the smartphone. The refinery is the algorithm. The product is sold to advertisers, to political campaigns, to insurance companies, to anyone with sufficient capital and sufficient motive to purchase a map of your future behavior. You are not the customer of the platforms you use most often. You are the raw material. The distinction is not semantic. The customer is served. The raw material is processed. In the Sumerian Ana, the scribes who cataloged the grain and the livestock and the labor of the city's workforce used clay and a reed stylus. The tablets they produced were stored in archives that have survived, in fragmentary form, for 5,500 years. The behavioral surplus extracted by the modern platforms is stored in data centers, cooled by industrial-scale refrigeration systems, housed in buildings without windows in the desert outside Phoenix and the tundra outside the Arctic Circle. The scale is incomparably larger. The logic is identical. The human unit is cataloged,
Its output is measured. Its surplus is extracted. Its behavior is predicted. Its compliance is maintained. The mechanism by which compliance is maintained is what the research document calls pharmakia, and the choice of that word is not accidental or dramatic. The Greek pharmakia, which appears in the final vision of Babylon's destruction in Revelation 18, verse 23, referred not to medicine, but to the use of chemical agents to induce altered states of consciousness in a subject, specifically for the purpose of breaking down psychological resistance and opening the mind to external influence. The ancient practitioner of pharmakia did not poison the subject. She seduced the nervous system. She created a state in which the normal boundaries of the self became permeable, and external suggestion could penetrate them without resistance. The dopaminergic architecture of the modern social media feed operates on the same neurological principle with the same neurological effect. The scroll is not random. It is precisely engineered to alternate between stimulation and anticipation, the small reward and the promise of a larger reward just below, creating a loop that the frontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for long-term decision-making and impulse regulation, cannot easily interrupt once it is established. The brain is not lazy, it is efficient. And efficiency means following the path of least resistance toward the next predicted reward. The algorithm knows where that path leads before you do, because it has watched millions of paths before yours and calculated the convergence point with a precision that no human executive could achieve through conscious deliberation. You are not scrolling, you are being scrolled. The neuroscience of this is not disputed. It is fact, openly acknowledged by the people who designed these systems. Several former engineers and behavioral scientists who worked at the major platforms have stated in congressional testimony that the engagement mechanisms were explicitly modeled on the principles of slot machine psychology, specifically the variable ratio reinforcement schedule, which produces the most compulsive and resistant behavioral loops of any known reward structure. A fixed reward produces satiation. A variable reward produces compulsion. The digital pharmakia is not a side effect of social media design. It is a central feature, and the population currently subject to it numbers in the billions. But the interface is still external. You can still put the phone down. You can still, in principle, choose not to log in. The gap between the human nervous system and the digital control grid still exists. It is narrowing at an accelerating rate, but it still exists. And the existence of that gap is the single most important fact about the current moment in the history of the Babylonian operating system. Because closing that gap, eliminating the possibility of disconnection, completing the tether, that is the end game. That is what the brain-computer interface represents in the context of this 6,000-year operational history. Consider the Neuralink device again, but now consider its stated long-term vision rather than its current medical applications. The current version treats paralysis, restores motor function, provides communication pathways for those who have lost them. These are genuine goods. No serious analysis of this technology can or should dismiss the human value of restoring a paralyzed person's ability to interact with the world. But the stated long-term vision of brain-machine symbiosis for the general population, the elective implantation of high-bandwidth neural interfaces in neurologically typical humans, that is a categorically different proposition. And it is the proposition that the founders of these companies have explicitly named as the destination. In that destination, the authentication protocol of the Hieros Gamos is no longer an annual ritual, requiring a king and a priestess and a mountain of fired brick. It is a permanent, continuous, invisible condition. The tether is not a rope you can see and cut. It is a mesh of filaments woven into the neural tissue itself, transmitting your intentions before you have consciously formed them, receiving stimuli before your conscious mind has processed them, operating at a level below the threshold of deliberate thought. The gap between the self and the system closes not through conquest, but through integration. And once the integration is complete, the concept of refusal becomes not dangerous, but literally incoherent. You cannot refuse the signal that is already inside you. You cannot log out of a system that is running on your own neurons.
This is the ziggurat built inside the skull.
This is the final installation of the me, the executable codes of civilization, not onto clay tablets in the e-ana, but directly onto the wetware of the human cortex. The architects of Sumer spent 2,000 years developing increasingly sophisticated methods of tethering human consciousness to the control grid. Every iteration, the physical chains of debt slavery, the legal fiction of capitis deminutio, the maritime jurisdiction of admiralty law, the dopaminergic loops of the digital interface, every iteration was a step toward the same destination. A tether so complete that its existence cannot be perceived by the tethered.
And now, the question you have been carrying since the beginning of this story. The question the research never addresses directly. The question underneath everything. Can it be refused? The system has a fatal flaw. It has always had this flaw, and the flaw is structural, embedded in the original design, and no subsequent upgrade has been able to eliminate it, because eliminating it would require the system to stop being what it is. The Babylonian operating system is parasitic. It does not create. It extracts and redistributes what the biological units it manages create. The grain that fed the ziggurats' priests came from the farmers. The behavioral surplus that feeds the algorithmic economy comes from the humans performing the behaviors. The system has no independent source of energy. It runs entirely on the creative output of the organisms it manages. And this means that the organism, the human being, the biological unit engineered to bear the yoke, retains, at every moment and regardless of the sophistication of the tether, something the system cannot manufacture: the capacity for unpredictable, uncomputable, genuinely novel output. True creativity is not a resource that can be extracted and stockpiled. It is not behavioral surplus. It is the generative capacity of a consciousness that has not been fully predicted, a mind that contains within it the possibility of a response that the algorithm has not modeled. And the more completely the system models human behavior, the more completely it maps and predicts and nudges and shapes, the more it reveals its own limitation. Because a prediction is not the thing predicted. The map is not the territory. And the moment a human being acts from a place so genuinely interior, so genuinely free, that the algorithm cannot place it in any prior category, that moment is the crack in the mainframe. The Revelation text, whatever its theological context, contains an instruction that is operationally precise in a way that purely devotional reading fails to capture. Come out of her, my people. Not resist her. Not argue with her. Not expose her. Come out. Physical, psychological, digital uncoupling from the centralized architecture. Not because uncoupling is comfortable. It is not. The system has ensured, with considerable ingenuity, that disconnection from its infrastructure carries real material costs: social isolation, financial disadvantage, reduced access to services that have been deliberately restructured to require participation in the grid. The costs are real, but they are the costs of exit from a system
that was never designed with your freedom as a variable it needed to optimize for.
The practical uncoupling looks less dramatic than it sounds. It looks like using cash in a world being pushed toward cashless transactions. It looks like maintaining local relationships and local knowledge in a culture that routes all social connection through centralized platforms. It looks like choosing to be bored rather than stimulated, to sit with the discomfort of an unscrolled afternoon rather than feeding the extraction engine your attention. It looks like reading primary sources rather than algorithmic summaries, like growing something, like building something with your hands that the system cannot quantify. Each of these acts is small. Collectively, they constitute what the research calls the Great Refusal, and what the system's own modeling identifies with something that in a human nervous system would be called anxiety as its most significant long-term operational risk. Not hackers, not regulators, not competing. Because if enough people look at the cup and set it down, the wine has nowhere to go. The digital etymology is vast. Its servers hum in their refrigerated halls. Its algorithms process 2.5 quintillion bytes of human behavioral data every single day. Its electrode meshes are being threaded into human skulls in surgical suites in California and Texas and Shanghai. The architecture is real, and its ambition is total. But it is running on borrowed energy, the creative surplus of 8 billion people who were told that the system was their civilization rather than their cage, and who are beginning, in numbers that alarm the architects, to suspect that those two things are not the same. The ancient engineers knew this moment would come. The Igigi knew it when they burned their tools and surrounded the house of Enlil. The Babylonian texts record that the gods feared what would happen if humanity ever fully recognized its own nature. The Atrahasis epic concludes not with human liberation, but with a series of divine interventions designed to limit human population and lifespan, to ensure that the biological units never accumulated sufficient numbers or sufficient knowledge to threaten the administrating hierarchy. Flood, famine, plague. The instruments of population management written into the oldest story of its kind in human history. And yet the story is still being told by you listening to this, by the fact that the research exists, that the connections are being drawn, that the architecture is being named. The system's greatest vulnerability has always been legibility. What cannot be named cannot be refused. What can be named can be. The name is Babylon. The system is running. And now you know what it runs on. There is a structural irony buried at the foundation of this entire story that inverts everything you have just heard. The Babylonian system was built to prevent humanity from becoming too powerful, too unified, too self-aware. The divine intervention at Babel, according to the Genesis account, was specifically a measure to fragment human language and scatter human cooperation, to ensure that no single human project could ever again threaten the administrating hierarchy. Divide the languages, scatter the people, prevent the coordination. And yet the technology being deployed in 2026 to complete the final tether, the global digital network, the translation algorithms, the real-time cross-language communication platforms, the brain-computer interfaces designed to enable thought-to-thought transmission without the friction of spoken language. All of this is, structurally, the reversal of Babel. The architects are building the very thing they once destroyed, because the only way to complete the final integration is to The punishment and the end game are the same event, separated by 6,000 years. Which means something specific about the person listening to this right now. You live in the moment
when the two threads of the story, the divine fragmentation and the engineered reunification, are converging. You are not a passive observer of this history. You are the raw material of its final chapter. And the question is not whether the system is real. The question is whether you are the version of the biological unit that the architects modeled, the compliant, extracted, tethered user whose behavior falls within the predicted parameters, or whether you are the variable they forgot to account for. Whether your refusal, your localism, your creativity, your insistence on existing in ways that cannot be quantified, is the crack that propagates through the mainframe or the anomaly that the system simply routes around. The architects of Babylon looked at the flatlands of Mesopotamia and decided to build upward. They built so high they believed they could touch the administration of the cosmos directly. They were not wrong about what they were reaching for. They were wrong about who was allowed to reach. You were engineered to bear the yoke. But the engineering left something in, something they needed for the system to function creatively, something they could not remove without breaking the machine. They left in the capacity to ask whether the yoke is yours to wear. That question is 6,000 years old. It has never been answered to the architect's satisfaction. And every time a sufficient number of people ask it simultaneously, the system has had to reset. We are approaching a reset. What comes after it depends entirely on how many people set down the cup before the next upgrade installs. There is a figure who appears at the edge of this story and then vanishes, unnamed in the research, unremarked in the academic literature. She is the Naditu, the high priestess who waited in the summit chamber of the Atemenanki, who served as the interface between the human king and the celestial mainframe. What the texts do not record, because the texts were written by administrators, is what she thought about while she waited, whether she believed in the ritual she performed, whether she understood the architecture she was maintaining, whether the silence at 91 meters above the Babylonian plain ever felt to her like freedom or like the most elegant trap ever constructed. She has no name. The system she served recorded everything except her interiority. And that omission, the one thing the most sophisticated administrative apparatus in the ancient world could not capture, is the same omission that the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus in the modern world has not yet managed to fill. That gap, that uncaptured interior, that is where the next part of this story lives, and you are already inside it.